Finally, today we'll hear from Duncan Patton. He's a research professor with the Department of Land Resources and Environmental Sciences at Montana State University and professor emeritus of plant biology at Arizona State. He received an AB degree from Amherst College, MS from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and PhD from Duke. And his research interests include arid and mountain ecosystems, especially the understanding of ecological processes of western riparian and wetland ecosystems.
Originally, Julie Stromberg was asked to give this talk, and she's in D.C. Discussing some major grant funding in that. So she asked me if I would come in and sort of stand in for her. And my comment was, if I'm going to stand in for you, this talk is not just going to be yours, it's going to be both of ours. Well, the interesting thing is Julie is a real detail person. She was a grad student with me in the 80s, and it was always fun being in the field with her because when we went out there, she's down there on her hands and knees practically studying the plants, and I'm looking out across the landscape, and I'm a real generalist. So if you can imagine a talk put together by that mix of people and a discussion of what lessons are we going to talk about. So what this slide shows you is just a mix of some of the lessons, some of the ones I'll be talking about, but what is a lesson? And this is some of the comments that are made. We should look into the future. Well, lessons are something from the past. You don't learn something if you don't do something. But the idea is if you've actually learned something, then you ought to be using that in your future restoration activities. The other thing, in both Julie and my mind, is that when we talk about restoration, it's not restoration in the true sense of it, and that's been discussed today, restoration where you try to take something back to what it was, or pre-Columbian period or something of that kind, but where you actually reestablish a functional ecosystem with most of the parts and most of the processes, which means it may not be like it was and may be more dependent on conditions today. And you can call that rehabilitation if you want to, but it's sort of the loose word often used for restoration. So one thing that becomes important to us, and I think to many people doing riparian restoration, there's sort of two approaches to it. One is passive and one is active. And many people think more of the active role, where you actually go in and you might want to put a stream back. You might want to change the channel morphology in order to encourage riparian vegetation, or you may want to go in and plant plants. You may want to do a lot of things that actually uses equipment and that you actively go in. But passive restoration is something we've been pushing for years, that if you can essentially establish conditions that are conducive to reestablishment of riparian plants in the whole riparian system without plowing up the stream or without major changes, but actually removing stressors, and I'll show some pictures of that, perhaps you can restore a riparian system in a quicker way. So what this gets at is that riparian systems are extremely resilient. I think most of us realize that. If you change something, all of a sudden you often see riparian plants appear and the whole system begins to reestablish itself. It doesn't mean it gets fully reestablished right off the bat, but it tends to come back in time. And if you look at this diagram, let's see if here, and this was discussed, there was a discussion, I forget who the speaker was, talking about resistance and resilience. It's interesting because if you look in the literature today, often the two are tied together. There's a tendency to talk about resilience and meeting resistance. Resistance is, it was pointed out earlier today, is the ability of the system to basically withstand the stress. And resilience is the ability of the system, in a sense, to be impacted, but when the stress is released, to be able to quickly come back. And then obviously the other steady state is no change, and then you get a unstable state where the system responds and continues to respond, and you end up with a new steady state. But if the question is, why a high level of resilience? And what you'll see on some of the slides here are some of the articles that actually these diagrams come from, that either Julie or I and the students have worked on. One thing Julie has looked at is seed banks. And it's interesting, it's one of these things we actually, when we were first working in the Provo River study years ago, we were curious whether you could actually establish seed banks. And do riparian systems establish a seed bank that if conditions return, the seeds of the riparian species then are readily available to reestablish? And it's true. There is a considerable amount, some of the studies they've done in the Southwest, considerable amount of seed bank stored in the system. And if we take a look at one system here, and these two diagrams, I don't want you to take a look at the whole thing, but the y-axis is the wetland indicator score. 1 is basically wetland species, and 5 would be upland type species. And if you take a look in these two communities, but you look at the depth here of where these seed sources are, and when you, at the greater depth, you essentially have lower numbers, meaning at the greater depth you have wetland or riparian type seeds. And so they're ready, but you might have to scour a little bit of soil off to get to these seeds, or they may wet and come up through it. But this indicates really the high potential for some of these arid lands, riparian systems. Even if the stream's been dewatered for a while, the seeds sit there and wait for the right conditions to come along. Another thing that actually happens with some of the riparian systems throughout the Rockies and the arid regions is they're not only are they prolific seeders like cottonwoods and that, but a lot of them actually reproduce asexually. So again, if you introduce the right conditions and you have some of the plants there, they may root sprout. Cottonwood is a good example. Certainly the ones, the narrow leaf and black cottonwoods and some of the species, but not the Fremont cottonwood. That's not a root sprouter, but it certainly is a prolific seeder and disperses widely. And the question then you ask is, are those plants there? In other words, you're not going to have seeds if you don't have enough mature plants. They can blow a long distance, but in most cases, unless you've totally dewatered the stream for decades and decades without, some water, and in many cases cottonwood and some of the other species can withstand a long period of drought. They just sort of hang on, a few of them, and then they come back, and we'll see an example of that in a minute. But if you look at removal of stressors, and this is a diagram that I put together some time ago and ended up publishing just a year or so ago, the whole point of this diagram is that all of the items around the outside here are, in a sense, stressors to riparian ecosystems. And those of you who deal with streams and just stream processes or stream organisms, these are somewhat the same stressors. Urbanization, agriculture, grazing, mining. You can look at the list, and they all interact with each other. Some of them influence some of the other stressors. But if we remove some of these, and it's difficult to remove many of them, obviously we're not going to remove urbanization, but we could remove or change grazing practices, or we could change agricultural encroachment in riparian areas, or we can deal with groundwater pumping or diversions and things of that kind. And so it is possible, from a passive restoration perspective, to actually remove the stressor. And here's the one example. This is near Mono Lake. The two of the streams that flow into Mono Lake. One is Lee Vining Creek, this one here, and one is Rush Creek. And both of those were essentially dewatered during the period after Los Angeles started developing the Owens Valley and the aqueduct and things of that kind. And so the water from these streams essentially were diverted to LA. And they started putting water back in it, and the Lee Vining Creek here has essentially a natural hydrograph, more or less. And I'll say more or less. but it has enough of a natural hydrograph to stimulate recruitment of nearly the whole complement of woody riparian species that are available in the area. On the other hand, Rush Creek, the hydrograph for Rush Creek, they tend to release the high flows in late June, or let's say nearly in late July, when the storage lake, is finally full. Well, what happens here is the cottonwoods, there are cottonwoods, but most of these are old sprouts that survived, and from them you may get some recruitment asexually. Whereas other parts of Rush Creek, it's mainly willows that are coming in that are able to come back in even with abnormal hydrographs. The other thing that this talks about, again, removing stressors, and this is sort of one of the classic pictures. This is San Pedro River in southern Arizona, and this was in 1984 when it was heavily grazed. Well, I mean, ranchers, you show this to ranchers and say, they say, we never graze like that. Well, unless you're out there really controlling your cattle, they do gather in riparian areas in the hot southwest or out in desert lands. It's where the shade is, it's where the water is. And so this is pretty well, to use a non-scientific word, hammered. This is taken from exactly the same spot, from a bridge. And this is what's come back, and now you have a natural little channel flowing through here. And there is a flow in the stream, and there's actually water here, but there's nothing growing. This is along the edge of the stream, and from the same point, and you're not looking at a great deal of time between these two. It shows, again, the resilience of the system once you remove grazing. Just one of the stressors. Okay, now, passive versus active again. If you decide to go to active restoration, channel modification, for example, or restoring flows beyond restoring flows, let's say, you modify the channel basically to adapt to restored flows, patience is required. And I say, well, okay, why do you mean patience is required? Because even though riparian areas are resilient, it may be a little while, like 2 years, 3 years, before plants begin to recruit. And the example I'll give you is the Provo River. Jack talked about this. The restoration not very far from here, but if you take a look at this, originally the Provo River was essentially channelized, and then the idea was to put meanders back into it, as this map shows, and this is one of the meanders, and this is a sort of a point bar that's been reestablished. So this is very active restoration, and I'll mention this. This is later on. I talk about stream floodplain connection. Here's just to give you an example, I'll show more. This is a disconnect between the stream and the floodplain, which is another one of our lessons. So this is the Provo River, and this is the point bar. And in 2004, they actually planted this. It's one way to speed up the restoration process. But 2 years later, there was enough flow over this point bar that there was natural recruitment. Now the question is, are you willing to wait 2 years, assuming you have the right hydrograph and enough water to do it, to actually stimulate recruitment on your point bar? So this is where the patience comes in. I think it's a lesson we all need to learn on a lot of things. Okay, stream flow restoration. Well, we looked at that in Lee Vining Creek. That's removing a stressor. I put this in because adaptive management becomes critical in many of the restoration activities. And this is just one example where adaptive management has played an important role in restoration of a river. This is the Lower Owens River. This is above Owens Dry Lake, which used to be the terminal point of the Owens River. And it is now, they've studied it, and they agreed with Los Angeles to rewater the Lower Owens River. And this basically shows a sequence of shots of a little trickle, more flow here. And so what was agreed upon was during wet years and for spring flood, 200 cubic feet per second. As a base flow, 40 cubic feet per second. And during non-real wet years, it could be anywhere to keep a base flow or up to 100 or something like that. But basically, potential of a 200 CFS spring flood, that basically the peak hydrograph would be a snowmelt, equivalent of a snowmelt hydrograph off the Sierras, and a base flow. Well, that's fine. That was an initial agreement. Is it the right set of tools for restoring this riparian area? Well, they have additional problems that are mentioned down here. I mean, there's still grazing in the area, and so they have put up exclosures to see whether they can solve that. And one other problem that's happened is that in many areas along the stream, and mainly because of the 40 CFS base flow, is they've gotten tules developing in here, which they did not want. Basically, the channel is beginning to close in. So now they're going back and re-examining the establishment of riparian vegetation during those flows, initially agreed upon flows, and are thinking, okay, how do we modify this? Well, adaptive management, if done properly, is a good way to look at all restoration, in the sense that if you do it right, you have certain restoration goals, and those goals are should be based on conceptual models, and I'll show you one a little bit later, that type of thing one puts together, at least that I would put together. And then, because that shows how you understand that system, and then you say, all right, if we trigger this or we change this, we can get, based on the conceptual model, we can get something to happen. And then you may do some experiments, a little bit of experiment, a major experiment, or basically, if you know enough, the information is there, you go ahead and do the project. But this leads to, that type of adaptive management leads to the appropriate type of research. Okay, this is another example of putting water back in a system. This is one of Julie's studies on the Bill Williams River and they're re-watering it. But what they're using is this recruitment box that was developed by Stuart Rood and his group. And basically the recruitment box says, during what period of the year do we get seeding, and what year for cottonwoods and for willows, for example, and then we tie into that a hydrograph that has the appropriate declining limb of the hydrograph to satisfy the seeding of the species you want. And there's attempts to do this on the Bill Williams River. And again, that's using science to be able to start determining what is the best riparian area. Okay, river floodplain connection. This is something that I think a lot of people often tend to forget. It's critical for stream ecology, if you're into micro and macroinvertebrates and things like that, so organic matter exchange, the need for overbank flooding, and the like. And if we take a look at an example here, Provo River is one where they've done that. They've essentially reestablished that connection. Here's an example on the Yellowstone River where we have a major disconnect in this bottom area here. Those are big stones. That's not a natural stone wall. Those are great big stones that are about 6 feet by 4 or 5 feet and all stacked. People refer to this as the China Wall if you float the river. Here you have a natural floodplain connection. Well, this is what can happen. This is one of the 100-year floods. We had 2 100-year floods back to back, and it flooded the land, some of the ranch land in that. A lot of the ranchers didn't like it, and so one of the ranchers decided that the thing to do is put the Yellowstone River back where it belongs, where the river belongs. I don't want it on my floodplain, and essentially came out and built a great big dike like this, and essentially put the river back in the river. Well, the first attempt at this was done in the spring when there was 150% snowpack in the mountains. Well, the dike disappeared that spring, and they ended up having to rebuild it, but not quite in the same place. Okay, if you're planting plants, again, one should have a sense of what's there. In other words, what are the soil traits, what's the hydrological traits, how deep is the water table, and things of that kind. Is the soil too salty? Your plants won't survive unless you irrigate them all the time. If the water table is too deep, your plants will never get to that. So if you're planting, which is an active form of restoration, you should know what the physical conditions are and chemical conditions. An example I give of that is the Nature Conservancy in California are buying up floodplains and replanting with valley oak and other floodplain species down there. And this example up here are plants that have been put in, they're being irrigated, and when I saw that, I asked them, how deep is the water table? Well, we haven't tested it. Well, they finally, a year later, they told me they had gone in here and it was about 12 feet down. Well, they're going to have to irrigate for quite a while. Whereas the other image here is basically not a slightly elevated floodplain, and they planted this, so this is 9 years later. So there is success if you really know what you're doing. Range of variability, and I'm going to have to speed up here. There's a lot of trade-offs, and let me just sort of go along here. Understanding what is the future. If we know the possibility of things going on in the future, we need to look at future climates as well as historic legacies. Historic legacies is the disturbances. What has taken place? The future climates, this is a study by one of Julie's postdocs, and that basically a projection of the change in some of the riparian species. And the cottonwood, depending on, if you look at the bottom down here, no change, warm, dry, wet, very wet. This is future projections for the next 100 years. And you can see the cottonwood community would decline. Most of the salt cedar community would decline. Mesquite would increase. And Saskatoon is sort of a mixed bag. Some would increase. So if you can project that, if you do restoration and you can project what the climate change might be for your area, you may have a sense of where it's going, and you may have to create the disturbance event, hydrological flow or something like that that creates disturbance, that triggers this. And a couple quick, this shows putting water in the Bill Williams River and the invasion of vegetation. And this is a natural flowing river here. This is sort of historic data, and the vegetation is not encroaching. So in the Bill Williams River, you see a decline in channel width and an increase in vegetation. And I think I'm going to quickly zip in. And when you get the trade-offs, in this particular case, here's a trade-off. When you increase your woody vegetation, you decrease your herbaceous vegetation. And we tend to think of riparian areas as woody plants. Riparian areas is a association of woody plants and understory and that of herbaceous plants. And if we go to restore riparian areas, we worry about getting cottonwood in or willow in or something like that. We don't worry about getting some of the herbaceous plants, which are a critical part of the riparian system. And down here, so the trade-off is, do you create a hydrology that would essentially encourage just woody plants, or do you have a hydrology that encourages both? Okay, some outcomes are irreversible. That is, an example given here is on the San Pedro. If we take a quick look, we see there's still some perennial streams in some areas that were historically perennial are not there anymore. That's because of groundwater pumping. And some of the studies that Julie's done with her students shows that after 6 years, many of these areas that became non-perennial still are non-perennial. And basically, the consequence of groundwater pumping may be irreversible in some of these areas. Okay, the last lesson. Some irreversible conditions are there because of legal constraints, political decisions. Something we can't do much about. Deciding on how much water or who's going to pump what. And the example I give, study I've done on springs in Spring Valley and the desert, Great Basin Desert. We finally get to the Great Basin Desert. What this shows are spring flow patterns here. These are well clusters for Las Vegas. This is the one we studied. We had a spring here in Spring Valley. And this is one of our study springs. You can see all our wells in that. But this spring has enough water here to flow about 100 meters. And that's it. And unlike some of the big ones. And so this is the one that may be impacted. And this is the type of conceptual model that one can put together to say, all right, what's going to happen? And the only thing I want you to look at here is over here, if we pump from the carbonate aquifer, the effect is going to be on basin fill aquifer, on the spring orifice discharge, and we have various communities here. Some will be impacted, and some are strictly a result of upland natural precipitation events. But it's this kind of thing that one should have in hand if you're going to do adaptive management. Because then you know if we pump, we know what the effects might be. This is what we should be looking for. There are the 7 lessons. Read them at will. One more lesson. And I think this may be as important as all. No process or prescription fits all. Not one size does not fit all. So if you're going to restore riparian areas, you need to know what the conditions are. You need to go out and basically establish some kind of model and decide what steps you want to take, and if maybe research to start with, and then you follow that up with small projects until you finally get the system right. But you have to learn, you have to base it on history, and the last talk about historical range of variability, to me that is, if we can determine that, which is extremely hard for riparian areas, it's easier for upland species than that. But if we have some idea what the historic range of variability has been, can we build that into our model as well? And that's it. Thank you.
Time for a couple questions.
I thought you mentioned basically you have sort of this opportunity for what you might call designer hydrographs, where you can begin to look and see what species you want and how we can adaptively manage. Do you have a feel for how common or rare that opportunity would be in the streams that we around the West that we've altered in this way? Is this something that's going to, you just really have to have a perfect storm of right conditions, or is it something we can do fairly often?
That's a good question, because Stuart Rood is in Canada, Lethbridge, and he had 2 of his students work for the water managing people in the area. And so they have been able to not only move water, augment streams, operate dams, do all these other things in order to really fulfill this and reestablish some cottonwood systems downstream of some of the dams. But one of the things Jack talked about is sediment. We still haven't solved the sediment problem, but even the Provo River one, there's at least some agreement between the people operating the dam and the people still trying to restore the Provo River to get some of the more appropriate flow. So there is some of that. But, the great big dams, the Glen Canyon dams, Jack talked about adaptive management there. I know that group, it's having spent 8 years on that. And it's the same old boys that are saying, we're going to do it this way practically, even though they supposedly are in an adaptive management meeting. And so to do it right there, to reestablish what was downstream, well, if you wanted to reestablish what's downstream in the Grand Canyon, you really need to throw 100,000 cubic feet per second downstream to scour and take everything out. There was no vegetation until you got to the 100,000 CFS line. So that isn't going to happen. I think on smaller dams, maybe there's a potential to create hydrographs, but then often nature can overrule you. That happened with Lee Vining Creek. They planted it, and they decided they wanted the stream going this way, and they wanted some little ponds for brown trout and everything else, and they had all these plants in there, and Julie and I kept saying, don't, it's coming back on its own. Well, in February, a year or so after they planted it all, nature gave them a major flood and took it all out and put it back where it ought to be. and it's doing pretty well, So, but that's not the dam. There is some control, but not like a dam. So that's a good question. How do you create a model hydrograph? Unless you somehow have the dam operator in your back pocket, I guess, or something like that. I don't know. That's a good question. Other questions? Yeah.
Do you have some perspectives on how to get us out of the one-size-fits-all paradigm? Because somebody does some kind of a set of treatments, restoration that works in their system, they may have gone through all the conceptual model and stuff. Somebody else says, gee, this work, I'm going to do it in my system, and it's totally inappropriate. So do you have some perspectives on how we avoid that problem? Because I think it's very common, actually, in all kinds of areas.
So the question is, how do we get out of the trap of one model fits all or one method fits all? I hate to, this is promoting one's own self type thing, but you need to study the system before you start research. And you need to take a look. If you develop a conceptual model and you realize that there's certain components, for riparian areas, more or less the same conceptual model, but the magnitude of some of the processes vary. So you say in this system, this is a bigger magnitude and this is less, or what have you. And then you start developing your restoration program based on the model for the area you're in or the system you're in, which is slightly different than the other. And somebody can say, well, I use this model. And we've seen that. Your model's great. I'm going to use it. Well, what components of your model don't really fit what I have? I think back to desert biome days. That dates me in Logan. I used to come here in the mid-'70s, which also dates me. And the modelers, that's when we had modelers just starting to tell us what to do. And they kept telling us, we need these data from the desert. We said, those are irrelevant. Well, we don't care, but that's what we're seeing in models done in the eastern deciduous forest. This ain't the eastern deciduous forest, And then we took them out in the desert and said, this is what's functioning out here. And the problem is with some of the models, when they didn't have the numbers to fit in their model, they went and got them somewhere else where somebody had generated the numbers for a process. And guess what? That was in Louisiana, and we just plugged it into the Great Basin because they needed a number to make the model, the computer go, you might say. But I think there's nothing wrong with models, but as long as you realize that one person's model doesn't fit your system. The processes are there. I think this is true of most ecosystems. All the same processes are there. It's the magnitude of different processes that make one a wetland, that make another a desert. But still, all the processes are going on out there, whether they're physiological or physical or chemical or what have you. They're all going on, and they're more or less the same processes, but the magnitude is what counts.